On this program, we've heard from many voices on the SNC-Lavalin controversy, cabinet ministers, opposition MPs, political and legal analysts. Today, though, a different perspective. We've convened the Premier's League. How are 4 former premiers viewing this controversy? Here's part 1 of our conversation from earlier today. In Vancouver, Christy Clark, Premier of British Columbia from 2011 to 2017. In St. John's, Cathy Dunderdale, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador from 2010 to 2014. And here with me in studio, Alison Redford, Premier of Alberta from 2012 to 2014, and Kathleen Wynne, Premier of Ontario from 2013 to 2018, and the MPP for Don Valley West. Hello to all of you.
Hello.
Such a pleasure to have you here. Happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much. We're going to start, before talking about women in politics, with the big story of the past month, I guess you could say, here in Ottawa, and that is the controversy surrounding SNC-Lavalin and the federal government. Ms. Redford, I want to start with you because you were a former Attorney General in the province of Alberta. Today we see that the judicial review from that SNC-Lavalin had requested to the prosecution's decision not to go ahead with a DPA has been rejected. Is that significant?
Well, I think from SNC's position it is, because that was really their last alternative before the prosecutorial direction that's been set will continue. It was their last opportunity to see whether or not they would be able to have the prosecutorial service go in a different direction, and the court's not upheld that application. So I expect things will proceed as we've seen them proceeding in terms of the decision made to not proceed with the DPA.
Does it do anything to the government's the government's argument, I guess, that a DPA is something worth entertaining, worth talking about?
Well, a judicial review would be heard on the merits with respect to the decision that was taken as to whether or not to proceed with a DPA. So it doesn't in any way, shouldn't get into the merits of the case. So once that decision is dealt with, then basically everything reverts back to where it was. Now, we're not privy to all of the decisions that the prosecution has made in terms of why they proceeded or how they proceeded, but basically it's almost as if now that judicial review means that the review never happened and we're back on course in terms of the decisions that the prosecution will make.
Ms. Wynne, as you've watched this story unfold, what have you been thinking?
Well, not being a lawyer, my focus has been on, as a Liberal as well, not wanting to be forced into a position where I'm choosing sides. Obviously something has happened here where there has been, as the Prime Minister said yesterday, a breakdown in communication, there's a breakdown in trust. But I believe that both the Prime Minister and the former Attorney General and the other women who have spoken out are fine people. And I believe that these things happen in government where there are missteps. There's obviously something that went very wrong and it needs to be corrected. I think the Prime Minister started yesterday to address the concerns. I think that there's more that has to be addressed. But I want to see this fixed. I want to see a bridge built, and I want to see a better understanding among Canadians of exactly what happened and then how they're going to move forward.
Ms. Clark, talking about what the Prime Minister said yesterday, there had been people in the government sort of telegraphing that it would be a message of contrition. What did you think of his message yesterday? Was it a message of contrition? How would you evaluate it?
I wouldn't say he was overly contrite, but I will say this, it's really difficult as a politician when you don't believe you've done anything wrong. Sometimes politicians apologize because it puts the story behind them. And according to the media coverage, he wasn't willing to do that. So I will say this, though, from a political perspective, the law allows the Attorney General of Canada to overrule or make a different decision than her department made. And apparently her deputy and many other people were open to, people who are lawyers in the government, who are not political, felt like this should be looked at from some other perspectives. The Attorney General dug her heels in, decided she didn't want to do that. And for me as a politician who cared about jobs and built my whole career around growing the economy, when you're talking about 9,000 jobs, that is no small thing. And that difference of opinion, everybody will argue they shouldn't have gone about it the way that they did and all that. But at the end of the day, if you're talking about 9,000 jobs and the Attorney General is refusing to save them, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a pretty good argument to move the Attorney General and find somebody who wants to support a growing economy.
Ms. Dunderdale, is that how you view it, that the Attorney General refused to save those jobs?
No, I think jobs are just as important to Jody Wilson-Raybould as it is to the rest of us. It's hard to really be clear on a definitive answer to any of it because we're in a vacuum in lots of ways. You know, jobs are important. If somebody came and said they were taking 1,000 jobs away from Newfoundland and Labrador, we'd be concerned. And if there's a mechanism to do something about it, you'd want to explore that. But at the same time, you want ethical companies operating in your jurisdictions. And so, you know, where's the balance in all of this? And unfortunately, we don't have enough information to say one way or the other. In terms of the former Attorney General herself, I can imagine that this has been an extraordinary and difficult experience for her. And I think she's signaled along the way a number of off-ramps. And either they weren't recognized as such or they were ignored. And I agree very much with Kathleen. I think bridges have to be built and a way forward found for all of them because, you know, we need a continuation of the work that they're doing.
Can I make a comment
please.
as well? It's something that we've talked about in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but I think in the context of this conversation, it's important to remind ourselves that the role of Attorney General in a government is very different than the role of other cabinet ministers around the cabinet table, in that as Attorney General, we also serve as not only legal advisor to the government, but also as a cabinet minister. And so that professional and legal obligation to put the justice system and the legal system paramount is a different lens than other people sitting around the political decision-making table have. And it's something that is quite unique in the Canadian system. It's something that has worked well, and I think you could argue that as we've seen this process go forward, the system has worked. It's just led to a very unfortunate political event.
So sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I think that, I mean, the whole incident and everything we know about it so far, everyone's operated within the bounds of propriety and the law. So I think that's what in some ways makes it even more confusing for those of us who aren't on the inside. So what is the rift? How did it happen? And then what do we do going forward? Because I don't believe, as some of the critics are saying, that, you know, because of this, Justin Trudeau is not a feminist, or he doesn't believe in Indigenous rights. I mean, I just don't believe those things, and I don't believe
I don't
that
think they're saying that he isn't those things, but maybe the fact that he signaled them so clearly and, you know, and made them a big part of his image is taking a bit of a hit.
Well,
you don't think that?
Well, I think it's being said much more harshly by some.
I guess
of
depends who you're
the
talking
part.
to.
Yeah, exactly. You're being very tempered in
what-
your criticism, but I just think that to wipe away a value system that he clearly holds and to say that it is all wrong and all evil is not correct, and to say that that the former Attorney General was all wrong. You know, the truth is some combination of those things, and that's why the bridge has to be built. We need to figure out how to move forward from this obviously very problematic incident.
Ms. Clark.
There are two questions I have here, though, which is really why I've been, drawn into this debate so fascinatedly. Is one, so if you're a feminist, which I am, you can't fire or demote a member of your cabinet because they're a woman? I don't know. I'm a feminist and I did that. I'm sure there are other female premiers, former premiers, who've done exactly the same thing. So I think, first of all, I think we should question that for a lot of good reasons. The second one is, though, and this is what's really been driving me crazy about the whole debate, I was a jobs premier. I believed in job creation. And I would defy any leader of any current governments or of the current oppositions to say that if they were in the same position, that they wouldn't have been at least sorely tempted to try and make the 9,000 jobs live rather than die on a narrow legal interpretation by one member of cabinet who serves at the pleasure of the First Minister who's there. I mean, that's the thing that's kind of driving me crazy about it, because everybody's saying, all right, bad decision, terrible, broke the law, da-da-da-da. You know what? I don't think any leader in this country deserves to be Prime Minister if they wouldn't also say they would have fought like hell to save those 9,000 jobs.
Is it Ms. Dunderdale, though, that she is just any member of cabinet, or from her perspective, at least what we heard through her testimony, when she's wearing that AG hat, she's thinking very differently?
Absolutely, and I think Alison just explained that very well. And you know, the Prime Minister promised that we were going to do politics differently. And so, you know, one has to assume that the former Attorney General was operating from principle in terms of making her decision. You know, I don't think anybody can argue that Justin Trudeau is not a feminist or he doesn't care about Indigenous populations. I think his record speaks to just the opposite of that. He has moved that conversation forward in this country during his term as Premier. There's no question about it. I think where they went a bit tone deaf was when the story was leaked and the debate began as to whether or not Jody Wilson-Raybould had been demoted. You know, people in the caucus were purported to be saying, well, she was difficult to get along with. You know, they started a bit of character
We don't know exactly who it was, but it was anonymous government sources that leaked it.
You know, and the Prime Minister should have shut that down right away, because that's what happens to women all the time when they're being critiqued. And when the whole discussion arose around taking her out of Justice and Attorney General and putting her in Indigenous services, and for a very principled reason, she said, no, I can't do that. Instead of saying, well, there's an exception to the rule about, you know, you serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister and you have to go where he says, you know, instead of doing the power play of saying, well, you cannot go back, you'll have to go somewhere else, and at the same time, not honor the motivation you said for putting her in Indigenous services in the first place, was to have somebody really, really experienced in there. And I'm not casting aspersions on the current minister, but he certainly didn't bring to the table the most depth of knowledge around Indigenous affairs. I think that gives rise to the whole question around the depth of one's feminism, and that's where the criticism is coming from.
And I think those are the process problems that I think have led to this, right, Kathy? I think that's what you're saying. I mean, I think we can debate the merits. I mean, we can talk about the issues, and I agree with Christy that jobs are critically important. The Attorney General has a different role. I mean, all of us have sat around a cabinet table, and we know that the Attorney General has to put on a different hat when he or she is giving advice as the Attorney General. But I really believe that what has happened here is that there was a breakdown of some kind. I mean, the Prime Minister pointed to, you know, him, he said he should have known. He should have known that there was a problem between the former Attorney General and his Principal Secretary. He should have known. And I would say, yeah, he should have. Yeah. There should have been a much clearer understanding of what was going on in those relationships, what had broken down, what hadn't broken down. And there have been other people now who have spoken up, as you were saying. And I think that's really what has inflamed this, and it's painful to watch because these are good people, and there has to be some way to come back, and the only way to do that is to really understand from the inside, for the people who are involved, to really understand what is it that broke down, what made people feel that that trust was not there, and how does it get repaired.
Ms. Redford, even if that repairs whatever has happened on the inside, if that can actually happen, how about for the outside, for Canadians who have been watching this and very much trying to follow along and figure out what to believe, who to believe? How do I determine what's right or wrong in the end? Is there a mechanism for that?
Well, I think that so many Canadians that I've talked to have their own reaction to what everyone's version of events was. And my sense, I agree with Kathleen, is that I think you have a group of people who all experienced the same thing and all honestly believe that what they did was appropriate in the circumstances. And I can't speak any more to that. As Kathy said, it's in a bit of a vacuum for us. One of the things that I think is important that the Prime Minister did yesterday, and I'm glad he did it, was he talked about how we're going to actually move forward as Canadians with dealing with this contradiction between the Justice Minister who sits at the cabinet table and who's leading decisions around prosecutions. And in fact, in the federal system, it's probably more delineated than it even is in the provincial system, where theoretically, when I sat as Attorney General, there wasn't even a clear legislative line, although I never spoke to the Deputy Minister responsible for prosecutions in Alberta because I knew that that wasn't my role. It's not even as clear a line. It's something that lawyers know, it's something that prosecutors know, it's something that attorneys general have known. And I think it's important that we're now talking about that from a policy perspective and clarifying it in a way that Canadians can have confidence in that system.
Would Jody Wilson-Raybould have known as AG? Like, would that line have been?
Absolutely.
She would have,
absolutely would have known. And I would actually say that everything that I've read in terms of her testimony demonstrated that she understood that line was one that she chose not to cross.
And I think that's the crux of the principle that she was operating on, you know, and she deeply understood it.
Ms. Clark, if on the question of how the public gets to some sort of understanding, decision on this, and I take Ms. Redford's point that there is a discussion now going on about separating those roles, but for the actual controversy, what's actually happening right now, is the Justice Committee where we're going to find answers? Is it the Ethics Commissioner? Is there a point at which you think Canadians will be able to say, okay, I can draw my conclusions?
I think there are two sources of information that I think the Justice Committee is going to be done with this. I mean, it's a Liberal-led committee. There's no way, I don't think, that they're going to really delve much deeper into it. I think there are two big sources of information. One is the work that the Ethics Commissioner will do, and when that process is concluded, we may learn more. The other is this. Minister Wilson-Raybould apparently was taking very detailed notes for a long time, and were those notes or some of those contents of those notes or some of those discussions she had from her perspective to become public, I think there's another chapter to be kind of written on this. And as Kathy said earlier, we are, you know, I mean, I just think, okay, I'm kind of outcomes oriented, jobs, you know, narrow legal opinion, I'm going to try and go for the jobs and find a way to try and make it work. But if you really want to get into the he said, she said, and understand who was right and what, kind of the nitty gritty of the drama on the inside, I think we're going to want to see Jody Wilson-Raybould's notes at some point, because she took, I think, a lot of them, and I think some of that may have helped determine Jane Philpott's been determinative in her decision when she decided to resign.
Do you think we need to hear from other people, Ms. Clark, that Jody Wilson-Raybould named? And I should, in the sake of transparency, say Ben Chin, for example, used to work with you. He's now the Chief of Staff to the Finance Minister. He was among those named. Do you think the Justice Committee will hear from them, and do you think they should?
I don't know. I mean, look, I can say from what I know of Ben Chin, he is a high integrity guy who probably felt like he was just doing his job. But I would say, though, in terms of what people are going to add, I think that Jerry Butts's kind of opposite view, rebuttal, if you will, of Jody's comments is sort of definitive, really. I mean, you're not going to get any different information, I don't think, out of any of the other actors in this. You'll just hear more of the same thing from all of them. If we want new information, I think we're going to need to go back to the principals in it, which are going to be Minister Wilson-Raybould, former minister, the Prime Minister, and of course the Ethics Commissioner, and perhaps former Minister Philpott would have something to say as well. That might be new information, and I think that might, you know, at the end of the day, if we want to really write all the pages of the drama, I think that'd help fill it in for us.
Ms. Dunderdale, as all of you have led your parties and your provinces, when there's a sort of political discussion taking place over how these two women, Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould, remain in caucus, because of course they haven't been kicked out and they haven't said that they want to leave. From a leadership perspective, how do you keep caucus together? How do you deal with that issue, do you think?
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister has much choice at this point in time other than to leave them where they are. And I guess it won't be any surprise to anybody in the country to learn that caucuses are not always in full support of their leaders, and yet we manage. You know, in this case, you know, it's a risk for the Prime Minister. There is no doubt about it. Because in all of these instances, damage to brand and to political hopes and ambitions and second terms and so on are often cumulative. And so leaving the two women in the caucus doesn't allow the Prime Minister and his caucus to draw a line under all of these circumstances in this story and move on. So if something happens to disillusion these two women and they walk away from caucus, all of this gets back on the table again. So, you know, he's between a rock and a hard place, but I think he's made the right decision in allowing them to stay.
Ms. Swin, what would you do?
Well, I'm just thinking that in a difficult situation like this, I think that, as I said, I think the Prime Minister started yesterday to shed some light on where he falls on this and his perspective. But I think there may be more that he has to say. I don't know what it would be, but I think he may need to say something more about how he's going to move forward, what the outreach is going to be. His, you know, he may have to go another level down about his understanding of what the misunderstandings were. I guess I just have a hard time believing that people who fundamentally have a deep belief in many of the same things, that there isn't a way to reconcile those, you know, and
do you think there's ever like a path back to cabinet for those two?
Well, I don't know. I guess that would be a question. And I think if I were in the Prime Minister's place, I'd be sure asking that question, you know, because I always tried to find a way to bring people together. It didn't always work, you know, and as Kathy said, there were lots of lively conversations in my caucus and cabinet. But I really hope that he is at least exploring what more he could say or do.